Good morning. As chairman of the UANI, United Against Nuclear Iran, I'm pleased to welcome you to this special event sponsored by UANI, a conversation with Special Representative Elliott Abrams. In a few minutes, Elliott will speak for a while and then enter into a moderated discussion with Ambassador Mark Wallace, who was one of the founders and CEO of UANI. I would like to just take a few moments here at the beginning to set the context for UANI and for where we are in our relations with Iran and in the region today. UANI was founded 12 years ago in 1998 as a not just bipartisan, though it was, but a nonpartisan organization devoted to a single purpose, which was to stop the Islamic Republic of Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons because it was such a radical expansionist and extremist power that was hostile to the United States. UANI was founded by a remarkable group of three people. Ambassador Wallace was one, Dick Holbrook was the second, and Dennis Ross was the third. And the stated goal, and I'll read from the beginning, was to prevent Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons by working to ensure the economic and diplomatic isolation of the Iranian regime in order to convince it to abandon its illegal weapons program and also to stop its support of extremism and its egregious human rights violations. And in the 12 years since then, UANI has been single-minded and nonpartisan in pursuing that goal. First, working with members of Congress of both parties to adopt successive economic sanctions against Iran for its malign behavior, then also working outside of government to pressure businesses globally to not run afoul and violate those sanctions. During the time when the Iran nuclear agreement that was signed in 2015 was being considered, President Obama, president at the time, the P5+1, UANI was very active in opposing the agreement because we thought it would give away the leverage that the economic sanctions bipartisan majorities in Congress had adopted for too little, much too little, and give Iran much too much. In other words, it did not end Iran's nuclear program, nuclear weapons development program, and it gave Iran enormous credibility and money. When President Trump came into office, again, pursuing our single-minded, nonpartisan policy, we were not just grateful, but thrilled, frankly, when President Trump withdrew America from the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear agreement, because we felt it was a bad agreement. And we have strongly supported the follow-on Trump administration policy of maximum pressure on the Islamic Republic of Iran, which Special Representative Abrams has been so instrumental in implementing and expanding in his time in the administration. So now we have a new administration coming, President Biden, and we will continue to pursue this single-minded, nonpartisan goal of keeping Iran from getting nuclear weapons. As such, we will say to our friends who are coming in with the Biden administration that the world today, that President Biden will find 2021 is very different from the world of 2015 when the JCPOA was adopted. And if as we believe, the JCPOA was a bad agreement in 2015. It would be really terrible to go back into it or anything like it in 2021. First, because Iran has really continued its awful behavior, suppressing human rights of its own people. Just this past weekend, executing a dissident journalist, Ruhollah Zam. That's just the most visible and recent example of the repression that is part of the regime policy in Iran, and that President-elect Biden has spoken out against so clearly. Iran has also used this time and money that it got from JCPOA to continue to support and earn its title as designated by our State Department as the #1 state sponsor of terrorism in the world. It's aggressively moved throughout the region, Lebanon, Iraq, Yemen, et cetera, Syria. And it has developed its missile program and has continued, in our opinion, to violate the promises it made under the JCPOA. So to go back into a bad agreement would really be a significant mistake. And we will urge the Biden administration not to do that. The other factor, so that Iran has not changed since 2015 in the way that the supporters of the JCPOA hoped, in some senses, promised. It's gotten worse, but the region, the Middle East, has changed quite remarkably, most notably with the extension of diplomatic relations and peace between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco. Quite remarkable, and in my opinion, and not just mine, none of this would have happened without the change in American policy, which put us back on the side of our allies in the region and against our sworn enemy, Iran. So one of the, we will argue with and discuss with the incoming administration that one of the clear priorities of President-elect Biden, as he has stated it, is to build our foreign policy on strong alliances around the world. And that's, in my opinion, a good foundation for American foreign policy. And it's a good foundation, a great one for American foreign policy in the Middle East. So before any steps are taken toward Iran, I feel strongly, UANI feels strongly, that the incoming Biden administration should enter into discussions, consultations with our allies in the region, Israel and the Arab nations, as well, of course, as our allies in Europe who are part of the P5+1. In this context of transition, of a remarkable change in policy toward Iran under President Trump, and a concern that we know that it will be different under President Biden, but we hope it won't be too different, because much has been accomplished in the last couple of years in the Middle East and in our relations with Iran. So we are delighted at this moment of transition to have with us Special Representative Elliott Abrams. Brings with him an extraordinary record of service to our country in foreign policy under President Reagan, President Bush 43, scholarship think tank work at the Council on Foreign Relations, and now the work he's doing as Special Representative for Iran and Venezuela in the Trump administration. After Special Representative Abrams speaks, he will enter into the conversation with Ambassador Wallace. I do want to say that the Q&A function on the webinar will be open throughout the event for attendees to ask questions of Elliott Abrams. It's my honor now to introduce and thank for being with us, Special Representative and good friend Elliott Abrams.
Thanks very much, Senator Lieberman. It's great to see you, if only virtually. And you won't be shocked to learn that I find myself very much in sympathy with the remarks you've just made. And I did want to start today where you started, with noting the execution of Mr. Zam, the journalist, which is a kind of reminder of the nature of the regime that we're dealing with, which would kidnap and then execute this journalist. And this comes after just a few months after the execution of the wrestling champion Navid Afkari. Again, a reminder of we're dealing with a radical and brutal regime that does not abide by international law. And that is why we get back to the fundamental question of not permitting the world's greatest state-sponsored terrorism to acquire nuclear weapons. The sanctions have been successful in forcing Iran to want to come back to the negotiating table, and they do. And in those talks, it's important that the US focus on the ballistic missile program, the regional terrorism and support for violent proxies, and the hostage taking that Iran does, in addition to the nuclear file. But those items I will not really discuss today. We'll discuss the nuclear aspect. They're important. They're critical. But I want to talk about 3 points that I think we all have to use as guides for our policy on the Iranian nuclear program. And the first is the question of the fact that it began as, and has always had an aspect of being, a weapons program. Those trying to solve the nuclear problem should remember why and how it is that we face this challenge in the first place. Iran's prior covert efforts to develop fissile material production capabilities related from the beginning not to peaceful purposes, not to nuclear energy, but to nuclear weapons ambitions. Iran started its efforts to build a uranium enrichment capability hidden from the IAEA by using equipment from AQ Khan. The material production was part of a broader covert program that included work to design and build nuclear weapons. After its secret uranium enrichment facility at Natanz was publicly exposed in 2002, Iran built a second clandestine enrichment facility in a fortified underground bunker at Fordo. And the nuclear reactor Iran was secretly building at Iraq was ideally suited for the production of weapons-grade plutonium. And we should not forget that even after Iran halted some nuclear weapons work when faced with US and other international pressure in 2003, it continued to develop certain nuclear capabilities that it began, at least in part, in order to be able to produce nuclear weapons. Even worse, we now know that the Iranian regime also preserved and hid a massive amount of documentation from its nuclear weapons program, hid that, kept it together, while keeping many of the original scientists who had worked on it together, working on related dual-use technology. Iran's actions give every appearance of wanting to retain the option of bringing all those elements back together again. And as Iran continues to expand its proliferation-sensitive activities and its enriched uranium stockpile now, today, it better positions itself to break out and produce the nuclear material those scientists would need to produce nuclear weapons. Over a year ago, the IAEA's Board of Governors met in a special session to address the detection of chemically produced uranium particles at an undeclared location in Iran. Now, nearly 2 years after the Secretariat's initial engagement with Iran on this topic, 2 years, the IAEA's Director General, Mr. Grossi, recently reported that Iran's responses remain, quote, unsatisfactory and, quote, not technically credible. In the vernacular, not technically credible means the explanations are lies. Separately, in March, the IAEA notified the board of the organization that Iran had refused since January to grant the required IAEA access to two locations where the agency is investigating the possible use or storage of nuclear material. At one location, the agency's questions involve indications of possible processing of uranium relevant to an enrichment plant of the type Iran originally built in secret at Natanz. At the other location, the second location, evidence of past preparation for the use of specialized equipment has led the IAEA to raise questions about, quote, the possible use and storage of nuclear material, close quote. So the question remains, was nuclear material there in the past? And if so, where is it today? These issues, in combination with past high explosive testing at the site, raise really very worrying questions about possible nuclear weapons work at that location in the past and possible nuclear material that may remain undeclared to this day. The Director General noted indications of activities at both locations consistent with sanitization. Iran's extended denial of access to these locations was unprecedented under the additional protocol. Ultimately, Iran did not provide access for well over an additional half a year, and only then, after the board passed a unanimous resolution in June calling on Iran to provide full cooperation without delay. And you remember, in 2015, President Obama, then Secretary of State Kerry, Wendy Sherman, repeatedly promised the American people and Congress that the inspections regime under the JCPOA would be sufficient, that we could have access to any site when we needed to. Do you remember the claims of, oh yes, 24/7, 24/7? When in reality, the inspections regime in that negotiated deal in the JCPOA had major shortcomings that allowed Iran to delay access to sites without immediate repercussions. Given Iran's unprecedented obstructionism with the IAEA and obstruction of IAEA access, there must be consequences built into any deal that treats such obstruction with the seriousness it deserves. Unfortunately, the near religious devotion that some people have still for the JCPOA has prevented real accountability for these actions. Verification of Iran's compliance with its obligations under the Non-Proliferation Treaty and its IAEA safeguards agreements, including the additional protocol, is critical. And even more so in the case of a closed country like Iran that does not have a free press, that regularly jails and, as we've just seen, even executes journalists. The IAEA is the one reliable mechanism we have to verify and monitor Iran's nuclear program expertly and independently. On top of those serious issues, the IAEA also continues to investigate the possible presence of undeclared uranium metal pictured in records of Iran's past nuclear weapons program at yet another undeclared location in Iran between 2002 and 2003, a location that Iran has since heavily sanitized. Even in small quantities, uranium metal can be used in nuclear weapons research and development. Again, it seems that Iran has been unwilling to cooperate with the IAEA to address this concern. On all these matters, the key question remains outstanding. If nuclear material was present at some point at those locations, where is it today? Some people have said, well, these are merely historical matters, but they're not. their core safeguards concerns regarding potential undeclared nuclear material in Iran today. When coupled with Iran's apparent determination to maintain the option to reconstitute its nuclear weapons program, these blatant refusals to cooperate fully with international inspectors lead to one conclusion. Iran has shown time after time that it is not responsible enough to have an enrichment program. With this pattern of deceit, we can never be sure that such a program would not be used as the basis of a nuclear weapons program. I want to turn to the second guide, I think, which is preventing the option for a nuclear weapons sprint by Iran. Under all those circumstances, it's vital to prevent Iran from positioning itself for a sprint to a weapon. First, by accumulating enriched uranium, and then later in a possible breakout to nuclear weapons. And Iran, with significant capacity to enrich uranium and with a large stockpile of enriched material, is an Iran well positioned to try finally to rush across the goal line to nuclear weapons. And that point's critical for understanding the way ahead. And it's why we must not legitimize such a buildup of capabilities and material. It's also critical to understanding the degree to which we actually have remained in fundamental agreement with our European partners, even with all the disagreements we have had, particularly at the UN. Fundamental agreement with our European partners and other responsible states regarding the underlying threat of Iran's nuclear program. If Iran were to build up the dangerous enrichment capabilities that the Supreme Leader, Khamenei, has outlined, or that are included in the law that recently passed the Majlis and the Guardian Council, that would be a severe threat to international security and regional stability. The United States and our international partners strongly agree on that point. We've seen over the last year and a half how the regime has used its enrichment levels and its growing stockpiling to try to extort the international community into providing it with sanctions relief. And that is precisely why there must not be a legitimization of any nuclear enrichment by Iran, which is a massive flaw in the JCPOA. So it's critical that any new deal prevent Iran from having the ability to continue uranium enrichment or stockpile enriched material. This should remain a key goal of our diplomacy in the months and years ahead. Whether one loves the JCPOA or hates it, will soon be irrelevant. The major nuclear restrictions under the JCPOA begin expiring in just 5 years, 5 short years. And without a new agreement, there will be no obstacle to Tehran's acquiring capabilities that all responsible states agree that regime must not obtain. We cannot afford another resigned approach to further sunsets of restrictions under the JCPOA. Frankly, similar to the Security Council's approach to conventional arms embargo under UNSCR 2231. And simply re-entering the JCPOA without extending the duration of its key restrictions is really folly. Whatever one thinks of the Obama administration's deal in 2015, it's time now for all countries to work together to persuade or force Iran to accept new and enduring limits on its nuclear program. How? To reach such a deal, a better deal, the international community must continue imposing powerful sanctions on the regime while offering it the prospect of significant relief. Sanctions are a critical tool in addressing Iran's malign behavior, and sanctions should not be set aside until we have agreed terms that permanently end Iran's proliferation threat and address its broader destabilizing conduct. Finally, one more point, and that is about Iranian negotiating and bargaining. You know, the Iranians are very practiced at coercive bargaining and at nuclear extortion. While we continue to pursue a new and better deal, we need to remain wary of falling into negotiating traps, and we must refuse premature concessions before an effective deal is negotiated. Some observers are already convinced that only significant concessions to Tehran up front can get it to back down and return to the negotiating table. I mean, that's exactly what the regime in Tehran wants us to think, of course. So we got to avoid that trap. They would not be talking so much about negotiation unless they were desperate for sanctions relief. They only came to the table last time because of sanctions. And that's the only reason they will come back now. Only this time, our sanctions are much stronger. And you know, their defense budget now for the coming year, just released in the Majlis, is down 24% compared to this year. They are in dire straits economically. We should also remember that Iran fears a united response from the P5+1, and it has walked a careful line until now, exceeding the JCPOA limits just enough to generate alarm, but not pushing forward so dangerously as to drive the Europeans and the Russians and the Chinese to join the US pressure campaign. We still have great leverage to influence Iran's actions. In standing firm against Tehran's negotiating game, we should take heart that when it comes to Iran's compliance with its IAEA safeguards obligations, recent months have shown that a strong stand can elicit Iranian cooperation, no matter how begrudging it is. We must continue our strong support for the IAEA's exercise of its full authorities in Iran and ensure that all safeguards problems are promptly reported to the Board of Governors. In particular, Iran's endless delay and dishonesty over evidence from a site that it had not declared to the IAEA is unacceptable. The recent success of US diplomacy at the board in pressing Iran to grant the required access to IAEA inspectors shows that when nations act together, we can rein in Iranian misconduct. So for all these reasons, when it comes to putting permanent limits on Iran's key nuclear capabilities, we should remember that it is Tehran that has the weaker negotiating position, and the regime knows it. We should not throw away our advantage. We must not let Iran's efforts at nuclear extortion work, and we must keep Iran from building up enrichment capabilities in any legitimized fashion. To do so, we should continue to combine sanctions pressures with that availability of real relief for Iran, provided that the regime accepts enduring limits on its nuclear program through a comprehensive deal. The US and our international partners share a strategic interest in such a new deal. That's why it's vital that during negotiations, as Joe Lieberman just said, we work closely and consult closely with partners, especially Israel and our Arab partners who are Iran's neighbors and who continue to be in the regime's crosshairs. Just as critical to the success of any arrangement is congressional support, which the Trump administration pledged to obtain. The INARA, the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act, which President Obama signed into law in 2015, requires that any, quote, agreement, close quote, any agreement, regardless of the form it takes, be submitted to Congress for review. Any agreement or any attempt to return to the JCPOA that circumvents Congress would be dooming us to fail yet again. Success in preventing Iran from ever obtaining a nuclear weapon is something we should all wish for, and obviously something we must all continue working to achieve. But I repeat, we have the upper hand. The regime is under huge pressure. We have great leverage. Let us use it rather than discard it at this critical juncture. Thank you.
Special Representative, thank you. Elliott, as always, your remarks are insightful and timely. And having worked with you for many years now, there is no one more experienced and has been working on this file longer than you. I don't know if that's a compliment, Elliott, or a testament to your age, but it is a compliment because no one knows this business better than you. So thank you. A couple questions that I'll kick off, and hopefully we'll get some good questions from our participants. You really have focused correctly, in our opinion, on the nuclear file on the day. One of the criticisms of the JCPOA is that it left Iran with effectively an industrial scale nuclear program that could be restarted, if you will, very, very quickly. And I think since that time, we've seen several actions occurred. We saw the Israeli commando raid that amazingly took the entire warehouse of research and archives of their nuclear program out of Iran and into Israel, which was remarkable because that was the research and the important paperwork of the nuclear program. We saw Mohsen Fakhrizadeh maintain his core nucleus of people in a separate organization ready to begin another organization. And we saw the JCPOA legitimize an industrial scale centrifuge program with advanced centrifuges and advanced centrifuge research. When Iran decided to pull out of the JCPOA last year, since that time, it has very quickly assembled a large amount of 4.5% enriched uranium by feeding uranium hexafluoride into its centrifuges. The quantity is well beyond the limits of the JCPOA. Why is that disturbing? And in my mind, it showed that Iran could restart its nuclear program in a flash. Can you talk to us a little bit about what those hallmarks of the research, the people, and the centrifuge capacity showed, and what they've done with that in restarting their nuclear program, and why would any civilian nuclear power need, what is it, several thousand pounds of 4.5% enriched uranium?
Yes, it's well over 2,000 kilograms
Right.
of enriched uranium. You know, let me come at that from the side. We actually do know what countries look like if they don't want a nuclear weapons program. South Africa is a good example. Brazil and Argentina are examples after the military dictatorships. They open themselves to the IAEA and to the world, and they say, we don't want this. Help us. Iran's record is one, obviously, of deceit, and you're right to point to the archive, because to maintain all of the records and the team under Fakhrizadeh was obviously meant to maintain the option of building a nuclear weapon. And we've now seen what the short-term use of it is. The long-term use could be to develop a nuclear weapon. The short-term use is what I have called nuclear extortion. That is, it's saying to the world, we don't care what agreements we made, and we don't care what limits we agreed to. If you don't eliminate all the sanctions, we'll keep doing this. So it serves both purposes for Iran. And the critical question is whether, as I put it, do we fall into this trap, and do we say, oh, please don't do that anymore and lift all the sanctions? And by the way, there's another problem there. If you lift all the sanctions, or most of the sanctions, as part of getting Iran to go back to the JCPOA, what do you have left to negotiate with? I mean, the Biden administration and many others have said, yes, we need to go beyond the JCPOA. It's true, it's 5 years old, it has great gaps in it, and there are all the other things, missiles, support for terror. You need leverage. We have leverage. And the leverage should be applied to all of those objectives. And if it is, I think Iran will have to give ground.
Our colleague and friend Norm Rule, who I think is on this call today, and I were speaking the other day, and we both marveled how we had focused on Iranian proxies for so many years, Lebanese Hezbollah, the Houthis in Yemen, Hamas, others. But we've also remarked, and perhaps you could speak to without revealing any super secrets, why it is, or is it apparent that Iran is operating its own extraterritorial adventurism by sending their own agents and operatives abroad to engage in mischief and no longer solely relying on proxies? And does that reflect and embolden Iran? Are we seeing more of Iran acting directly in its destabilizing activities, its meddling in other countries, its Quds Force, its MOIS? Do we see them acting more on their own in addition to their proxies now?
That's a very good question. I could duck it by saying, oh, it's all classified. But I think, no, I think actually, what is the Quds Force doing? For the most part, it's being used to organize and support those proxies. It is the main interlocutor with Hezbollah, for example, and with the Houthis. So I think they are still building new proxies. Hezbollah, of course, is not new, but the way they built up the Houthis is really quite amazing. If you think that it's just a few years ago when, they were a kind of small group that was active on the Saudi border and are now controlling most of the country. And they have all sorts of reasonably advanced weaponry, including missiles, which were obviously given to them by Iran. So I would say the Iranians are still trying to hide behind proxies, but they are more active in creating those proxies and bolder in what they ask those proxies to do. And if you think of the Houthi attacks, direct attacks on Saudi Arabia from Yemen, I think that's a very good example of it.
As you know, we've tried to operate and we have worked collaboratively with administrations since our founding and have had really bipartisan participation. One of the things that I give a lot of credit to some of our colleagues that are incoming into the Biden administration is the recognition that we've learned some lessons from that moment of time when the JCPOA was enacted. I know in talking to some of them that even Jake Sullivan has mentioned publicly that in fact, maximum pressure was successful without employing sanctions pressure by our European allies. In fact, Iran did not necessarily rejoin the community of nations as was hoped for by President Obama and others. And look, I think that there was well intentions in that time, but our colleagues that are incoming into the administration, I think have at least seen those lessons. Talk to us, if you could, a little bit about between the JCPOA moment of time and now, and the fact that maximum pressure has truly crippled that Iranian economy. And Iran, since the JCPOA, even right after the JCPOA, didn't re-enter the community of civilizations, but in fact engaged in very malevolent activities or increased its malevolent activities. Are those lessons to be learned? And what would you say to the Biden administration about those lessons I think we've learned?
Yeah, let me start with sanctions because I think there was a fundamental mistake made by the Obama administration, which was to say that you can predict whether sanctions, unilateral American sanctions, will be effective by reading the speeches of foreign ministers. So if the chancelleries of Europe said, we don't agree with this, well, sanctions parliament couldn't succeed. Complete misreading, because sanctions are not actually enforced by foreign ministers. The sanctions are enforced by 10,000 decisions or 100,000 decisions by corporation executives, by insurers, by company lawyers, by bankers and their lawyers. So as you mentioned, Jake Sullivan had acknowledged, and I think it was Walter Russell Mead interview in May, that, the unilateral sanctions turn out to work. And they work because of the central position of the United States in the world financial system. And people were, in essence, being told, choose, do business with Iran or do business with the United States. And they chose. The impact has been very great. After the JCPOA, the budget of the military in Iran immediately went up about a third. In the new budget submitted to the Majlis, the military budget goes down 24%. So that's just a rough guess. The rial is worth about a fifth of what it was back then. It's now about, when I last looked, about 265,000 to the dollar. And, you know, it's a police state, so it's hard to gauge exactly the degree of public dissatisfaction with the regime. But we do know what happened in November 2019. You know, a huge uprising of Iranians, which was suppressed with unbelievable and murderous brutality. We do know that Iranians communicate really more than anybody on earth on various forms of internet access. And we can get some idea of their views. And what they see is that this regime is using the scarce resources it has on the wrong thing. Give one example. Last spring, the Supreme Leader announced that there'd be another $1 billion being given to the Ministry of Health because of COVID. In September, the Minister of Health said publicly, I never got the $1 billion. And he said, what could be more important than giving the Ministry of Health the $1 billion now? Well, we know the answer. All Iranians know the answer. For the Supreme Leader and for the rest of the regime, you know, Hezbollah is more important. The Houthis are more important. Hamas is more important. Shia militia groups in Iraq are more important than the health of the Iranian people. So I think what we've learned, some of these things we should have known. The Iranian people continue to want what they wanted in 1979, which is freedom. The regime continues in its support of murderous terrorist groups and other proxies in an effort to destabilize the entire Middle East. We've learned that unilateral US sanctions can have an enormous impact. And when you look at Iran today, you see the leverage that the US has to insist on a much better deal than the JCPOA.
Thank you for that answer. In talking to some of our incoming colleagues, they also understand that it's a different Middle East now. So much has been made about working with our allies. And look, there are many authors and persons that were responsible for leading to the breakout of some of the peace in the Middle East that we've seen at the end of the Trump administration. You and your office and your colleagues deserve enormous credit, obviously, for some of those agreements that have been struck. How does that change the complexion of the region? And when we speak of our allies, I think it's very easy for us conventionally, because we've been referring to our allies as our European allies, who certainly are important,
Yeah.
and our key longstanding allies. But now we have another block of allies that are working more closely than ever before, and their voices are very important, and they feel the effects of Iran's mischief and potential nuclear operations every day. Talk to us a little bit about the change of the region and how that impacts these negotiations, and how the incoming administration should include those voices in any negotiation.
I think one has to say that there is no more significant driving force behind the Abraham Accords than Iran. That is the sense of a common enemy. Let's be frank about it. And combined with that, the sense that the United States gets it, that we understand they are all put at risk by Iran, and they know it, and they wish to work together more closely to deal with that risk. They felt in 2015 very badly treated. They felt that this deal had been negotiated by the United States essentially without talking to them, without really consulting them and consulting their interests. They remember the comment that President Obama made that, you know, they're just gonna have to learn to share the region with Iran. All of this really, I think, was a wake-up call for them that led them to say, all right, we need to see each other as allies and partners now. And they're beginning to do that. Obviously, there's a good deal more to be done in the coming years. But I think the lesson for us is we have these willing partners, willing to work together and willing to work with us. So I hope the new administration won't do anything with respect to Iran without immediately saying, first, we want to talk to the European partners and the Russians and Chinese. We want to talk to our friends and partners in the Middle East whose security is directly at risk from Iran. I mean, after all, they have not stopped saying death to Israel. So to me, that's really critical here. But I want to add the other point about Congress. The JCPOA was done essentially without our friends, partners, allies in the Middle East, and without Congress. It wouldn't have passed. The reason it was never a treaty was the votes weren't there. But I think that INARA is very important here. And I think that Congress should demand a say in this. That statute was passed. And if you read it, and I commend it to you, it has a very broad definition of what an agreement is that has to go before Congress.
And isn't the fact that the failure of the JCPOA is not a treaty, whatever agreement that may or may not be struck with Iran, probably has to have bipartisan support? Because if you are talking to any CEO, compliance officer, general counsel of any business around the world, as we at UANI pretty much do every day as a full-time job, what do you say to them? Isn't it the fact that there can be no durability of that agreement absent its enforcement as a treaty, whatever that is? And that's why in a time when we are so pressed to find bipartisan issues, it's so important to actually have a bipartisan supported agreement. Can you speak briefly to that?
I think that's a very important point. And it's a point, frankly, that I expect when out of office to be making to potential investors. That is, unless we get a binding agreement, you know what's going to happen? Go ahead and build something in Iran, spend $1 billion, and in 4 years, sanctions will return, or you risk sanctions returning at the very least. Yeah. Why would you want to make that investment? So again, I think the question of the relationship of the American economy to this is critical. And I really, everybody understands the risk that comes from Iran. Why then should it be impossible to get bipartisan support for an agreement that would go to Congress that would deal with all of Iran's behavior? Obviously, if it's a third-rate agreement, if it's an agreement whose sunsets are tomorrow morning, and in some cases we have that. I mean, 5 years in the context of Iran is nothing. If we have a bad agreement, you can see why it wouldn't be submitted to Congress. But of course, the hope we all have is to use the leverage that's been built up to force Iran into an agreement that it does not want, under which it needs to make the concessions that it would rather not make, but that guarantee international peace and safety.
Now, I feel like I was holding this question, but I feel like you've answered this question throughout this entire discussion. But let's pretend for a moment that Secretary-designate Blinken and our friend Jake Sullivan are on this panel or sitting here with us. What would be the key things that you would say to them right now as you leave office and they come in and say, look, it's different now? And obviously you've addressed that in a big way, but what's the advice that you would say to them? I put you on the spot. I didn't mean to do that.
The first thing I would say to them, make no agreement with Iran, without getting our hostages out. There are 3 Americans being held. I think it was a disgrace, frankly, in 2015, that this was not included, and that Iran was able to continue to hold people in 2015 and 16 when the treaty came into effect. Excuse me, it wasn't a treaty. The deal came into effect in early 2016 while they held Bakr Namazi, who, by the way, is still there and is 84 years old. It's amazing. So I would say, look, you have a great opportunity. You have a better opportunity than you had in 2013 to 15. We have proved that unilateral sanctions work. We've got tremendous leverage, and we've got a much more united region than we've ever had. And we proved in the vote in the IAEA board in June that you can actually get the Chinese and Russians on some of this because they don't seem to want Iran to get a nuclear weapon either. So it's a much better situation. Use all of that leverage to get a much better deal. Don't discard that leverage. It will be very hard and it will take a long time to build it up again. So use it. And if you do use it, and if you're insisting on tough terms, and you have a tough negotiator, and I hope they get one, then you'll get bipartisan support and you'll get international support, and you'll get the support of our partners in the region whose necks are on the line.
Thank you for that. What about this moment in time internally in Iran? We've focused so much on the external pressures. Maybe as a last question, in my mind, Iran is facing a very dynamic moment. You have an economy very much in tatters. You have a lot of internal fighting, and you have a very aging and sickly supreme leader. Obviously, there's a lot of potential dynamic moments that could occur between now and the adoption of an agreement, but you have succession issues, a crumbling economy, and the like. What does that do to change our approach to Iran, the internal dynamic of Iran?
You know, you talked about and I did too, about the archive, and we've seen the killing of Fakhrizadeh. And I mention those because it's a reminder that Iran is not 10 feet tall. I think all of these changes internally and the situation in Iran should also remind us of that. They have an election coming in June. The supreme leader is elderly and not in the best of health. In the next administration, 4 years, it's perfectly plausible that they will have a succession too. They have an Iranian people who are clamoring for improved economics in Iran. So there, excuse me, let me get rid of that.
That's Secretary Designate Blinken who's coming, wanting to respond to your remarks.
I hope not. We'll talk to him later. So I really think, you know, this is all a reminder again of the way in which the situation has changed. And the new administration is now presented with an Iran that has lots of troubles, lots of problems. Fundamentally, a population that doesn't want this regime to remain in power. You know, if they thought they could win a free election, they'd hold a free election. Major economic problems. Isolated in its region, with countries around it that view it as a threat. It goes back to the question of I would say, the relative strengths of the United States and Iran. And that's where something like the way in which it was possible to get the archive out is critical. It's a reminder. Iran is a country whose people have very much to be proud of historically and culturally. But it has a regime which is ruining that country and its economy and putting its resources in all the wrong places. That's a regime that we should negotiate with from a position of the strength and the power and the leverage that we have.
Thank you, Elliott, for everything that you've done and all of your service.
Thank you. Thanks very much. This has been a great pleasure. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Joe Lieberman. Happy holidays.
Thanks, Elliott, and thanks, Mark. It was an excellent discussion. Ambassador Wallace, I think you're ready for prime time.
Oh, no.
But,
that's Elliott Abrams.
Yeah, but Elliott, I do want to say that I certainly hope that Mark's hypothetical of a conversation with Secretary Blinken or incoming NSA Sullivan is realized, because these are smart, thoughtful patriots. And the arguments, the case you presented today was not ideological, it was not political, it was certainly not partisan. It was very much fact-based. And I take two overall lessons from it. The first is that in attempting, as we assume the Biden administration will, to achieve a better nuclear agreement with Iran, we can't just think of Iran as we hope it will be. We have to focus on how Iran has behaved and how it continues to behave today. And as you said, what we see is a pattern of deceit and behavior that is, if anything, worse than it was before the JCPOA. The second very point, I think, is that that there is, in Iran has a history, and I really appreciated your terms, of coercive bargaining and nuclear extortion. And we have to recognize that as we sit at a table with them, if we ever do again, and understand that we have the upper hand. And in a way that we didn't, in my opinion, do in 2015, we have to negotiate from that basis. So I think it's really important that you get the chance personally to convey that message to the critical foreign policy leaders in the incoming administration. I will tell you that we will do our best to convey the same message, and we will continue to work in Congress with members of both parties. And this is the last word. For years, American policy toward Iran has enjoyed broad bipartisan support in Congress. That broke, divided on party lines in response to the JCPOA. In the last couple of years, a series of actions in Congress, we have seen a return to that kind of bipartisanship on Iran. And I think you've suggested something today to us that is really important for us and others to make a priority in the next phase during the Biden administration, that it ought to be the goal of the Biden administration, if an agreement with Iran is possible, to have that agreement be ratified by members of both parties in Congress. And that is an attainable goal if the negotiations are conducted according to the realities that you have described today. So I can't thank you enough. I wish you well in the remaining days and weeks that you have. And I have a feeling that you will continue to make things harder for Iran and better for the United States in the time you have left. And then Godspeed to you in the next chapter of your extraordinary career of public service. Thank you all for attending. I wish you all a good day.